Innovations, which is a fiber and textile company. My focus is exotic fibers and putting them into use to create textiles. That's my background. I have been in fibers and fiber producing livestock for 34 years. I started with Angora rabbits and loved my rabbits and had my rabbits for a very, very long time. I migrated from the rabbits to Mohair goats, and I equally loved them. I then got sheep and discovered that sheep personality and Winnie don't get along. So I found new homes for the sheep, and I went to Cashmere producing goats. The goats and I were the best mix for me. In the process of raising goats, I discovered alpaca and raised alpaca for 17 years. So I've kind of gone the gambit of livestock fiber producing animals and all aspects in between, and through that course of time I became a fiber judge. I judge alpaca fiber on and off the animal. I judge yak on and off the animal. The yak fiber protocol I wrote and designed 7 years ago, and it's become the standard for yak fiber in this country because it didn't exist before that. When I raised Cashmere producing goats, I did judge goats. It's been quite a long time since I've actually had the opportunity to do that, but I did do all aspects of the animal livestock realm so that I understood what was required to produce good fiber on those animals. So that's kind of the background. It kind of gives you where I come from, why hopefully this topic is something I know something about. I have been doing this for a very long time. It's a passion of mine. I'm very hard to get to shut up. I appreciate you guys coming out to hear this. There's an awful lot of great speakers here, and you have to make choices sometimes, so I appreciate that you chose to come and hear me. Give it a couple of seconds. Take my photographer's. That's probably better. I'm not big on photography. I will not stand in front of your screen. I have in front a number of fiber types here. On this end of the table are man-made, rayons, nylons. There's some natural fibers here as well. On that end are the exotic fibers that I base my expertise on. And hopefully I'll get to pass some of these around if we have time. If not, definitely stop up and see them, because a lot of these relate to the blending portion of the talk. But before we get into that, I do have to give you a little background on fiber so that you understand why blending works with these fibers, what doesn't work, and the characteristics that make the fiber what they are. It goes a long ways when you understand that background of the fiber to be able to say, okay, now I understand why you would put this type of fiber together with that and still get a good quality product, or why if you put something else with it, it doesn't work. The latecomers always have to sit way in the back. They told me I had a maximum of 72. I don't think this room can hold that many.
It's 125.
Oh, I don't think there's that many chairs.
We counted the chairs.
Yeah. Oh, did you? Okay. All right. So, for those of you who just came in, I'm just starting, so you're really not that late. So when we look at fiber, they asked me to focus on cashmere, mohair, and wool. And what I'm going to do is kind of give you their makeup and design of the fiber style, and give you an idea of their similarities, and then talk about a little bit of their differences, and then go into the blending aspect using all three of these, since there's a variety of you that raise different livestock in these types. I'm not going to talk heavily into, let's see this works. There is a pointer there. I'm not going to talk heavily into yak, although it's probably one of my passions. We have llama, we have camel, we have alpaca hiding up here, there's a guanaco over here. We're going to concentrate on small ruminants since that's what this conference is all about. And I did bring samples of these other guys. I have kibiid as well. I have bison, they're not in the picture. But as far as blending fibers, they also have similar characteristics that we can look at to discuss that. Let's see if I can make this work. Yes, it does. So again, our focus is cashmere, mohair, and wool. I appreciate the photographs from where I might have borrowed them off the internet. I tried to give credit where credit was due if I could find the source. Whoops, sorry. Uh-oh, I lost my place. Okay, so the things we're going to look at when we look at this is these properties of the fiber. And these are determining factors in grading the fiber and in salability of the fiber. These are the types of characteristics when you look at fiber that people are interested in if they're purchasing fiber. Fiber diameter is going to be the first one I'll talk about, and that is the micron. It is actually the diameter of the fiber. It's not the width of the individual fibers, it's the fineness, if you will, of that fiber itself. And this plays a major part in grading, which I will talk about more tomorrow if those of you are coming to the sorting and grading seminar. But this is very key in just about all fiber types, especially when it comes to blending. We're going to talk briefly on scale height and frequency, a little bit on pattern. It's not as detailed, but scale height and frequency affect how fibers interact with each other. So I'm going to go over scale height. Medulation, kemp, and guard hair. I think all of these livestock type animals all have some form of that. It's very difficult to breed it completely out because those are primary fibers. So you can't, because if you breed out primary fibers, you don't have fiber, you have very low yield of fiber on your animal. So most of what I see in this realm is people are breeding it finer. The micron, fiber diameter of those fibers get finer and finer so that they don't require dehairing or the type of processing to get them out. Staple length is key when it comes to processing, and what mill you might use and what method they may use to process that staple length. And then, of course, natural impurities. We'll talk a little bit about those. I think you know what those are pretty quickly. Yield is the volume of fiber that you're going to get off of your animal, and color comes into play. All of these play a major factor in the value of what you produce. So let's talk about fiber diameter. How many do histograms here on your animals? A few? Okay, so a histogram is where you take a sample of your fiber and you send it to a lab that has the proper equipment to do the testing. This is an old version, this one here. We can get it to come back. Oh, it's a very old version. They now have a lot better micrometers that can measure the micron. But your fiber is sent to a lab, and the fiber is under lab conditions. It is washed, it is dried, and it is brought back to a specific temperature for the testing. They put it into a hopper of a machine that cuts a 2 millimeter piece off of the batch of fiber that you send. It's not very big. And then the rest of the fiber gets tossed out. So whatever they test is whatever that little 2 millimeter piece is that they do. And they run it through a machine. The machine reads roughly 2,000 2 millimeter snippets and takes an average and then determines what the average micron is of those fibers. So if a micron is, I like it red. If this is a micron, which is a fraction, you can imagine, it takes an awful lot of fibers to be able to get an average. And if we look at human hair, it's about 30 microns. We're going to talk about the individual livestock and tell you what those microns are expected. But this is typically how they do the test. You get a nice little graph thing, and you get a whole bunch of data that you can use as a reference point. And when you look at that data, you're going to see the guard hair or the kemp fibers or the heavily modulated fibers in that, and they reflect themselves in your graph as a slant to the right. And if you want to see one of those, I do have those histograms are a day-long talk. Obviously, lower the count, finer diameter of your fiber. You want your fibers to be 16 micron, 17 micron, 18 micron for your cashmere. Mohair is a little bit higher, we'll talk about that. And sheep wool, because there are thousands of breeds, can be anywhere from 12 micron up. And all of it has a use if you put it into the right use. Sorry, not used to this sensitive touch. Okay, so if we look at cashmere, your down fibers that you're looking at, because it is a double-coated animal, should have an average fiber diameter, or micron, of 18 or less. And you don't want any of those to be above 28. I don't want any to be above 18 personally if I'm looking at purchasing that fiber for use, or if I'm breeding and I'm producing animals that have all kinds of down over 28 microns, obviously that's a problem.
Question.
Yes?
I don't understand the part where it says with no down fiber above 28 microns, where the standard would say 19 or less to be qualified as a...
That's correct. To be designated as cashmere, the standard does say it has to be 18 or less. But what happens when you look at that histogram, not all of those fibers are going to be 18 or less. The majority of them will be. And the histogram is what's going to tell you that. You can get down fibers that have a higher micron that fall into the average. And when you look at the area of the histogram, it's called a standard deviation. It tells you where that variance is on either side of 18. And if you're getting lots of it above 28 on that graph, you have a problem. Then it's no longer cashmere. But if they're all under 28, and again, you don't want them above that, but if the majority of them are falling above that, your average fiber diameter is no longer going to be 18. It's going to be something higher. And then you have something else that can't be designated as cashmere. The down fibers, if you looked at them with an electron microscope, and I'll show you a picture of that later, they're typically not hollow. There's very little hollow core in those down fibers. The outer strong fibers that are very obvious to see in cashmere, and I do have this cashmere up here you can look at. A lot of the fibers that I brought from the other exotics are also double coat, and they show the coarser fibers. That outer fiber is typically longer. It's definitely stronger in micron, and it should be obviously so. The differentiation between those two fibers are what it makes it dehair so well, so that you get the beautiful down fiber to work with. So having a fiber diameter of 50 microns or higher with that guard hair helps it process easier. There are, and I learned this recently, I understand some breeding programs that are bringing in to get your guard hair fibers to be finer and shorter, so that you don't have to go through the heavy processing of the fiber, and that would save you some costs as far as dehairing goes. But I will throw out there from my experience that guard hairs are guard hairs for a few reasons, and their structure is one of them, because guard hairs are hollow. They have a medullated core, which is hollow, which leads to a bit of stiffness in those fibers. And even though their micron may be lower, they are still hollow, and they are still going to poke. And for some people, they'll feel that in the yarn if you leave it there. So just something to keep in the back.
Not finer, just shorter.
Just shorter. Okay.
Right, you're not breeding for finer guard hair.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that, because the shorter ones will fall out easier in parting. But I've also seen fiber that is being bred for finer. And I just caution that I'm just throwing a caution to the wind here. You folks have been in this for quite a while. You know the fiber that you're producing. And I just want to say that it does affect end quality product. Short fibers will process out easier without dehairing, because the heavy short fibers will fall off the card drum as it's being run through it. So that actually can have a big benefit if you can get them short. And have a few people you can teach them to. When we look at mohair, And again, I pulled these stats from your standards. The other was from the Cashmere Association page, the standard for 18 micron. In my day, it used to be 19. So it's actually, it's still like, well, this particular document, which I have, and I'd like to talk to you guys about it because I printed it right off the internet before it came. It says 18, so.
No, but you're right, but when you, I mean, recently,
We haven't fixed our numbers yet.
Okay, so they're not fixed, but it's a suggestion that it should
It
be.
had been 18, and then there was a fairly recent change to 19, so
Okay.
depending upon the date on which it adopted.
So it's still fairly consistent then with what I'm used to, is was 19. So that's good to hear. It's, for it to truly be Cashmere, you want it under 19 micron.
That's
Right.
international law.
Right, that's the international, that's the ASTM standard, so it's 19 micron. So when we go into Mohair, and this is from the Mohair Council, they designate it fineness, and they give it a name. Kid Mohair is fine, 20 to 30, yearling, medium, 30 to 34, and adult strong, 34 to 39, and I have seen adult stronger than that. The designation, there are subgrades, again, that you could see up there. What I found was these are designations, not necessarily age of animal, when you're talking fiber. So someone can call something kid mohair in the marketplace that is not from a kid goat. It's fiber that is on the animal that when it's harvested is in the 20 to 30 range. And that was actually a new thing for me because I have always assumed kid mohair came from a kid goat, yearling came from a yearling, and adult from an adult. And that is not true. And I actually got a sample of fiber to prove it because I was shocked. And the fiber that I have is from an adult, and you would not know it if you were just looking at fiber. You would assume it was a kid. There are Kemp and heterotype hair fibers, similar to guard hair, that show up in mohair. These have been bred out for many years. They really are reducing that, and that keeps it so that the dehairing process is not necessarily needed when you process this. Those fibers do fall out in the card. Sometimes they do creep into the yarn, but I have found that they're not quite as strong as what you see in other double-coated species like Cashmere. So those heavier fibers blend in well with the yarn, and they don't cause as much of a difficulty with prickle factor or other irritations to the skin that people find. And I think maybe part of that is because mohair is typically on a stronger micron end to begin with. And once you hit 30 microns, most people can feel that rather easily. Again, your Kemp is the shorter ones, and they're really strong. They pop out pretty quickly and easily. They're really easy to identify. The other type of hair that's in there can vary in micron. It can be very similar to the rest, but typically it's stronger than the other existing fibers that are in there. And it does cause problems if there's a lot of it in there. And again, over the years, mohair breeders have been very conscientious of breeding that out. And it's been a good thing that we've seen in the process. When we look at wool, this is a hard one to isolate here because in wool, sheep are known in part in their standard by their fleece characteristics. And there are 1,000 breeds of sheep. So it's very difficult to say sheep should be X micron or have these characteristics because it really is dependent on the animal and the breed that they are. The wool should meet the standards. They have been documented for many years. They're very easily accessible to get the wool standards. So knowing what breed you have is your determination of whether your wool characteristics fit what your breed of sheep should have. What I have found in sheep breeds now, we do have some double-coated ones. You want to make sure that there is a strong difference in micron in those double-coated animals so that they process out easier. What I have found is a lot of the new crossbreeds that I see, and actually even a lot of the meat breeds, are producing some pretty consistent uniform fiber that can go into production for the right product. So if you are meat breeders, the fiber still has use and may be a secondary market for you for an income stream. It may not be a high one, but it's better than burning it or throwing it in a compost pile if you can find use for it.
Give me an example of some of the breeds that are down, like a sheep at like 15 and lower?
In micron,
Yeah.
now Merino's the first that comes to mind.
Fine, super fine.
Super fine Merino.
It goes down that low.
I have a 12 somewhere on here. Yeah.
And that's
It's not common, but they do go that low. Yep.
Merino in this
It was an Australian.
That's
Yeah,
what
it was an Australian. But I have seen Merino in the 16 range in this country, out west. So there are some people trying to do that. Okay. It's not very common. Most is 18 and up. Scale height, when we talk about scale height, we're talking about, so down here below. Okay, so if we look at this drawing down below, so your fiber diameter is, again, this part right in here. We're measuring across the fiber for your micron. Your scale frequency is how many of these little guys grow per 100 microns. And your height is the height of this little lip that you see on these scales. Okay, so this is actually a wool representation so that you can see it. And here's just another version of that. You can see the height. It's a little better angle in the drawing of the fiber. So cashmere, that height of those scales, which is what's key here, it rarely exceeds half a micron. Remember, a micron's a fraction. Very minute. So this is something you can only see in an electron microscope. But that height is so fine and smooth on the fiber, to giving it that soft hand when you touch it. The same with mohair. Surprisingly, its scale height is very, very low. And that's what's giving it a reflection of light off of that. It's what's helping it give it that luster that comes off of mohair. When we get into wool, typically your height is 1 micron on average with wool. So it's considerably higher in here. This doesn't want to work well. With wool. That, yes.
Would that low height also be the thing that's affecting the luster one sees in some long wools?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. So the scale height is what is directly related to reflection of light. And so the height of the scale and the frequency of the scale is what's going to determine how much light is bouncing back to give it that brightness or luster that you're looking at. With cashmere, you don't get a lot of that luster. The height's very smooth against the height of the scale is flattened, and the scale frequency is rather tight, so you're not having a lot of surface area that the light can bounce back off to get that luster to you.
Is scale height automatically measured when you send it for micron
No.
testing? Can you test for that?
They can,
It can.
yes,
And does that also affect the propensity of the fiber to felt?
yes, excellent. So especially wool, and her comment was, does that help it to felt? And yes, because these scales have a place to lock into each other in that agitation process. Those scales can lock. Now, when you put fiber in hot water, whether it's wool, cashmere, mohair, or any of the others, the scales have a tendency to open out. Now, they're not going to open really far, but the hot water triggers them to open. They kind of bloom a little bit if you could look at them under electron microscope when it happens. And I noticed they had a microscope, had I known. Because I love playing with that stuff. So when they open up in that hot water and they're agitating, those scales can kind of grab on each other. And when you shock it in cold water, for those of you who know how to do felting, okay, hot water, soap, agitation, shock it in cold. Hot water, soap, agitation, shock it in cold. They're going to grab. They're going to have more propensity to stick together in wet felting. Needle felting, the scales have no bearing. They don't care. Because there you're just mashing fibers into fibers. So wool, because it has such a wide height here, they open really far, and those fibers can just grab each other really easily. Now, some wool is not quite that high. On average, it is 1, but there are some that have a lower scale height. There are some breeds. So this is interesting. I first found this document, like this. I can't see it. Okay, I'm just going to use my hand. This came from National Geographic May 1988 issue. I bought it in an antique store because it had a picture of sheep on the cover. And that's what I found inside. Yeah, you know who knew? It's actually a really good issue if you can find a copy because it's all about wool. And this was in it, and I posted this on the internet, and it's kind of gone everywhere now. I see it everywhere. And I always will give it courtesy of where I got it. So if you're going to post that, please use the Cape from National Geographic. They gave me permission to post it, because I do ask. So in this picture, though, we have a coarse wool where you can really see the scales. Look at the shadows. You can see how deep the height of those scales are. So that's going to felt really well. Next to it is a fine wool, and you can see the scales are a little more tapered down. The shadows are not quite as deep. We go to alpaca. There's a lot of scales here per micron on this guy. And here's cashmere. So if you're comparing cashmere to wool, these are kind of choppy and pointy. You can see how smooth this is all the way down. Even though the scales have some height to them, they're very tight against the shaft of the fiber. And again, you can see it all the way around the room. Next to that, you have silk, linen, cotton, and polyester, just for comparison of some other types of fiber. But down at the bottom, I was able to pull some electron microscopic pictures of cashmere and mohair and wool. So if you look at the cashmere and the mohair, I apologize that they're not the same scale. But you can see, this is the scale structure. It's very tight to the shaft of the mohair. And the cashmere on the far side, again, very tight to the shaft. You can see the scales, very similar number of frequency between the two. And then this is the fine merino. And you can see how deep these are. And they actually stick out. And a sensitive person feels that. So we'll talk about what I use as a generic term, guard hair. Guard hair is a specific type of fiber, but unfortunately the fiber industry has kind of taken it that anything that's coarse in a fleece is guard hair, rather than its true definition. So it's been a problem. So modulation in a fiber is a hollow core. There is a core within the fiber called a medulla, and that fiber is, if you think of a dog bone, best correlation I can come up with, and you think of the marrow in a dog bone, okay? That's the medulla, and it's filled. When that marrow is chewed out by your dog, and you start getting spots in there, then you have a partially modulated medulla. If they eat all the marrow out of that, you have a fully hollow medulla, and it is most likely going to act like a guard hair. That help? That correlation sort of give you a vision of what it looks like. So in that coarse fiber, the stronger fiber, you'll typically find that there's more hollowness to that, which makes them stiff and pokey, and those are what we would call true guard hair. By definition, again, I use the ASTM standards. A Kemp fiber is short, and the medulla inside that core is at least 60%, that hollowness of the center. You can't see it without an electron microscope, so it's kind of irrelevant other than by touch.
When this fiber's first formed, is the medulla, is it empty, or is it actually
Typically they
grows
grow with. Now, the guard hairs are empty. They start that way, and that's why they're true guard hairs. They are a primary fiber, so they come out of the hair follicle first, and in a dual-coated, there are secondary fibers that are associated with them, and those secondary fibers typically have a more solid core in the medulla.
So the body must produce the Kemp for a very specific reason.
It's a protective fiber. All of these coarse fibers originally in these animals were there as a protective coat for whatever protection they needed, whether it was low brush prickers, briars, that sort of thing, depending upon where the animal originated in the species. So they were a protective coat. We're breeding them down and out because we can, because you have them on an environment that's protected. They don't need it as much anymore, and it's easier to get out if there's less of it. So again, Kemp, we don't see a lot of Kemp in breeds like alpaca and that sort of thing. The Kemp fiber has been typically in sheep for the most part that I see. I do find it occasionally when I see goat fiber. I do see some Kemp on occasion, but predominantly it's been in sheep. It was in Mohair. I think the breed's done a good job of keeping it minimal. Guard hair, unfortunately, I find in just about every livestock species there's some form of it, and again, I think it's because it's a protective coat.
I just asked one thing.
Absolutely.
We're finding with cashmere that if the guard hair is longer than the down, it protects the down.
Correct. Yes.
So it does, at least in some places, it's useful.
Is useful, especially in those areas where you have that. And I live in the desert Southwest, and that actually is very protective against cactus. You know, the fibers don't usually get caught and leave the down on the cactus where I live. So it does have a purpose. And again, we talked earlier that there's some breeding for it to be shorter to reduce the necessity of dehairing and processing. We're manipulating a genetic trait, I think, in the animal for our own use, and I can't say whether that's good or bad, in my opinion. I think length is probably one of the biggest things that is a factor in processing and in selling your fiber. And you can sell your fiber privately, you can make your own yarns, or you can sell commercially. There are entities that will buy your entire clip. And staple length is one of the criteria they look for. I know many of the wool pools I've gone to, length is one of the factors we've used in sorting out the fiber into batches for dollar value. You measure staple length from tip to the base. When I measure length, and what I teach in my sorting grading to measure length, I have a preference to sort or to measure length unstretched. And I know that's controversial for a number of reasons. The reason I teach that way is because when we sort and grade into batches of fiber, it's based on length criteria what batch it goes into. So if I am sorting my woolen sort, and my woolen sort has to be 2 to 3 inches long. Only fiber that's 2 to 3 inches long can get into that batch. If it's over 3, it goes into a worsted processing. And I measure a fiber stretched, and it just makes 2 inches stretched. But when I release it, it actually has a really good regain, especially wools, and it goes back to 1.5 inches. I'm putting 1.5 inches fiber with fiber that's 2 to 3 inches. And when I spin that yarn, that fiber is not going to have a whole lot of twist in it, and it's not going to hold in. And eventually that yarn is going to shed or kill. It's too short. If I measure it unstretched, I'm guaranteed that it's going to fit in that realm, because unstretched it's 2 inches. It automatically fits that batch. So I think it's important that when I'm processing, it goes into the right place. So that's the reason I teach that, and I know there's other comment about that.
Is there a problem on the reverse side that if, like the fiber is too long in an unstretched measurement?
Yes.
Right, because when it's getting, it is actually going to.
And the likelihood is, and typically, and again, if you come to the sorting, because we do look at length, and I pull it to see. So if I stretch it and it's just got an incredible stretch length, that crimp just pulls straight out and I get a really nice length. In some fibers, it doesn't regain. It doesn't have the elasticity that wool does, and it won't pull back to its original length. So stretching it is where it's going to go. In wool, though, there's excellent elasticity. About 82%, I think, is what the fiber has a tendency to pull back on. So if you've stretched wool 2 inches long, it's going to come back to its original 1.25 inches give or take. So you wash it and manipulate it and put chemicals in it and do all kinds of things to affect that. So if you stretch a fiber and it's too long, so I've stretched this fiber that is 1.5 inches long, and I stretch it and it makes it to 3 inches, it's still in my 2 to 3, isn't it, stretched? The likelihood is it's not going to stretch into the next grade. If it does, that's where I put it. If it's really that much of a length difference, I would sort to that. I don't see that very common, to get that much of an extension by pulling out trim. There is a limit for processing, especially with the artisan mills out there now, that if you are looking at length on fiber and it's over 5 inches long, there are a number of artisan mills that don't want to process it. Well, that really affects you mohair people, doesn't it? Because you get some really nice staple length. It even affects quite a few of the sheep breeds that I've looked at. So you have to be very selective in the mills you use, that you know they're going to process it well at the length that you have. And there are mills that do, but it is one of those questions you need to ask when you're processing your fiber. And we put anything over 5 inches into what we call long, so that it gets processed correctly by whoever's doing so. So any feedback from me on length? Because I educate, but I also like to get educated. And I like the feedback that I get. Okay. When we look at style on these, during the length, it's basically describing crimp. We all know what crimp is, or curvature. When we look at those downy fibers, and again, I refer to curvature as crinkles. Do you still use that term in Cashmere? Impurities absolutely will lower the value of your fleece, no matter what they are. And I'm not going to go into all of these unless you really need me to. We will look at some of these tomorrow. I have samples. Tender fleece. We all know what tender fleece is? So tender fleece is a fleece that breaks consistently in the same spot across your blanket. Whatever breed of animal it is, I don't care what it is, that's a tender break. I have a really good one for tomorrow if you come. If you take a staple and you hold it at the cut and tip end, and you pull straight across, okay, even pressure with your hand straight across. You can do it this way if that's easier for you. Don't bounce it, don't ping it against your ear, those are all techniques, but I'm telling you the easiest way to check for tenderness. Hold it at each end and pull. 7 pounds pressure, that's the average. If it's going to break, it's going to break at 7 pounds pressure. If it doesn't, it can get through the processing. So it'll break, you'll know it. It just comes off in 2 pieces, and your arms go way out here. Okay? So it's always important when you shear to test the fleece and know what you have. Because if you throw that tender fleece into a wool pool, let's just say, and they didn't do that, they just braided it, threw it in a pile, you've now contaminated that with all kinds of short fiber.
I find on some of mine, I'll get a tender fleece at spots, but I haven't quite figured out. Have you found there's certain areas of the sheep that are more likely to be tender, and that's where we should be testing?
The idea is that it should break everywhere. If it's breaking in a spot and then maybe another spot, that's a different issue. Tender break is a stress to the animal, and I'm sure in the nutrition talk tomorrow, hopefully, or maybe it was this morning, they'll talk about that, but I have found that stress breaks in animal are just that. It's a stress that's causing the break. When the fiber grows, fiber's nutrition-based. So when the animal gets stressed, their nutrition uptake, and I'll coin a term, and veterinarians probably get mad at me. I call it a nutritional uptake deficit. Doesn't mean you're starving your animal. It may mean he's not getting enough to eat, but for some reason, the animal has stopped absorbing the nutrients it needs for fiber growth. It may be getting them, it's just not absorbing them for that particular body application, and it breaks in that spot.
Most of the ones I've seen resulted from having a systemic illness that causes fever.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if
illness is a stress. Illness is a stress.
Why I have fleeces that sometimes, some parts they're just fine, and some parts
There's a lot of things that can cause a tender break, and obviously illness is one of them. That again causes a major stress to the animal's body and has a hard time producing fleece. What's happening if you were to look at it again under electron microscope, I love it, electron microscopes, I just, it's my thing. So the fiber's growing and growing and growing, and all of a sudden the animal gets stressed. And the fiber doesn't grow, it just gets narrow. And it goes on and on and on, and all of a sudden the animal overcomes it and it grows again. So you get this hourglass effect. That's where it breaks, because the fiber has decreased in diameter. And in a number of years ago, at least in the alpaca industry, any of you alpaca breeders here? Alpacas, it was said, you know, feed your animal less, your fiber will get finer. Well, yes, it does, but it's also very weak because you're starving your animal, and that's not a good thing. But what's happening is the fiber is just not getting the nutrients it needs to grow, so it gets finer and weaker.
For the first time today, Mary was saying that she showed a slide where an animal had gotten into the grain bin and feasted, and that caused a break.
Absolutely.
That was my animal. She was incredibly sick.
Right.
That break was equivalent to having a high fever.
Yeah.
It's lucky she lived. I mean, I had vets every day for 4 days.
So you can see stress really does, it can go in any direction. And I'll give you a quick example. Did you have a question?
Yeah, if that does happen, what do people do with the fleece if it's just breaking?
Depends on where it's breaking and what the length is. If you got that lucky break right smack in the middle of it, so it's all gonna break there, right? So now you have 2 inches and 2 inches, you can process that, can't you? It's all the same. It's when you get short, long, that now that affects that processing. It's great for felt. That's what I tell people to do. If you have a good hand spinner, they can work with it and get it by the tenders.
Also amazing to hang on to, because if you're giving pus at your farm,
It's
it's a
perfect.
perfect example.
It is a good example
Great.
to see that. And again, I have a really good one that somebody loaned me for the talk tomorrow, that hopefully they'll let me break a whole bunch of it. It does break pretty easily. And it's, you know, I give everybody a piece and you can break it and you get it. Do it once, you get it. So.
This is a tender fleece, but I have my foundation cashmere herd, long stapled, 2.5 inches, over a short guard hair. So that what I have is a straight tip, a tip that has been sun damaged.
Yes, and the tips
then
break.
at the end of my processing, I have a bag full of short pieces that have actually broken off, and so many of us are actually trending back to breeding that guard hair back in because of the damage. I actually jacket all my cashmere goats in the winter. And I probably ought to jacket them in the summer if I know that they're going to grow out their cashmere by June or July, because that's going to be the ones that have that straight tip, good crimp everywhere else, and then the loss of processing.
Yeah. And tip breakage it's sort of a tender thing. It's not triggered just by the same issue. It's not a nutritional uptake deficit. Tip damage is sunburn and environmental. Okay, so again, that's one of these environmental issues with that tip breakage. But I will say, it is a problem, because you're hand processing, I'm assuming, because you're saying you have a pile of it, so that means you're controlling it.
Yeah.
But if you send that to a mill, and you're talking about cashmere, which is, and finest can do it too, by the way, a too fine fleece can also break very easily. So you have to be careful that you're not mistaking that for tenderness. If you're doing the tender break thing, just since some of you are writing notes, you want a sample staple or a group of fibers that are approximately the width of a number 2 yellow Ford Ticonderoga pencil. Good visual, right? Okay. That's about how wide a sample you want. You want to be just able to see light through it. If it's too thick, you got its strength, and it won't break for you. But that's a pretty good correlation for you to remember. Tips that are damaged when they're processed into yarn become oils and little bumps and pills that will shed off. They end up in the yarn and they migrate out of the yarn. It works with all species. I don't care whether it's a goat, a sheep, an alpaca, a yak. It does the same thing in all breeds. So you want to be careful of sunburn tips. Blanketing is an option. It's not practical for everyone. So it's just something to be aware of. And again, the longer guard hairs, which are a protective coat, help keep that from happening with the double coats.
Just a note, we find that when you have a tender cashmere fleece, you blend it with something like 10-20% silk. That silk acts as a crutch, so it can prevent a lot of the fiber from breaking under the stresses of
Yep.
the process.
And then when we get into the blending, we'll bring that back up again if you would, because that's a very good idea. Yes.
I have mostly mohair animals, and I've been told you can't jacket them. Is that, you have,
I don't have experience there, but anybody else have a comment about jacketing mohair?
I also have indoors, the horns are a huge issue, because they get
Yeah,
caught into
those
each
are
other's, not necessarily their own. But I've also been told that the scrubbing action that happens can cause it to pop underneath, especially when you start getting longer ringlets.
So you'll start getting that felting at the skin level
You know, and I've tried jacketing.
with
them
any animal.
when they're first shorn, but past that, no, because I usually end up with something that looks like Swiss cheese because of them getting hung up with each other.
And I'll just pass on something I heard from a local person. We're a very wet environment. And if you jacket and it's warm and wet, you can get felting right under the blanket, as happened to this person.
Yes, and that can happen with any breed. It doesn't just mean a mohair goat. It can happen with sheep, it happens with alpaca, it happens with all types of animals. So be cognizant of where you live and what your environment is, and certainly if you're blanketing, I would hope that you periodically are taking them off to let the animal air before you put the jacket back on. Okay. All right. Again, uniformity for me, as a processor and a textile person, if I'm buying fleece, uniformity is the word here. That's why I do sorting and grading. I put the fiber into batches of uniform characteristics, whether it's length, micron, color. Those are the three dominant ones I look for. So if your whole blanket isn't uniform within the blanket, that becomes a problem. And if you hopefully can separate it out into portions that you can put this part over here into this batch to make this batch uniform, this goes with this batch to make that batch uniform, that's what sorting is about. So uniformity within the blanket is key. And for the most part, in sheep and goats, I see uniformity. It's the other exotics that we start getting all over the board. I do see a few sheep that are not as uniform as I would like to see across the blanket. And that's part of your standard, so it's something to pay attention to in your breeding program if you find that that uniformity isn't occurring, because it is part of a breed standard. Typically, cashmere, I don't see that. It's pretty consistent across the body, and the same with mohair. You may have to do some skirting, but overall the blankets are fairly consistent. Any staining, we all see that in every animal. Urine, soil, vegetable matter destroys the fleece when it comes to processing. So you do need to skirt those things out to make it a viable, usable fleece. Some will wash out, some might process out, but often they don't.
I was just trying to experiment, and I'm curious if your feedback of using hydrogen peroxide to deal with a little bit of the yellow fleece.
Okay, so hydrogen peroxide to use to help the yellowing in fleece weakens the fleece, in my experience. Has a tendency to dry it out, and in drying it becomes weak, and it is more likely in the carding process to break during the cards. So be careful there. I understand the reasons behind it, and it may be you're using a diluted enough amount for that. I will tell you, my favorite fleece wash is Orvis based. Cheap, easy to get, comes in big gallon drums if you want. And I found that it really does do well cleaning. The other thing, if you have a lot of yellowing, I use
How do you spell that?
ORV. IS. Orvis. And it's a paste, kind of, that hardens after time, and then it becomes just this block. But it's a neutral pH soap. That's the key there.
It's pretty liquid in warmer temperatures.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And you can use it even in its hard state. It dissolves in hot water pretty easily.
It's available locally, I think it's.
Agway,
TSC.
you have an Agway, Tractor Supply sells it now? And they started selling it in smaller containers. I used to have to buy it in a 5-gallon pail when I bought it. I still have my original 5-gallon pail. I have about this much left. So it's a long time, or share it with your neighbors. It's really not expensive stuff. But I found that that's the least damaging soap I can use for my fleece, and it actually works fairly well with the yellowing it actually comes out. If you're still having a problem, I'm a big fan of Multine Borax. Remember that? 20 Multine Borax. It does work as far as removing staining. And I've had some people say Unicorn Scour also works well.
Beyond Clean is really nice.
Beyond Clean.
It's very expensive, but you use very small quantities.
That's
A great tip.
The rinsing is so minimal.
Excellent.
Save a lot of money
On that, that's great.
I
So
use
Beyond
one-
Clean, what's the word? Yep.
Unicorn.
Great,
Yes.
good tips. Thank you. Okay, grease, dirt, dust, sweat, we all know what all of those are. I'm not going to dwell on those sort of things, but if they're embedded into the blanket, it's going to reduce its value drastically. So it also tells me a lot. If I open a fleece and I see dirt way down to the skin level, there's not a lot of follicle development in that animal to keep the dirt away from the skin. You might get a dirt line in the fleece, that's acceptable, but it shouldn't be way, way down where that dirt is getting way down to the skin level. And that's something that you need to look at your genetics and see what's going on there. Felting on the animals, where I'm referring to here, cotting is the term that's more familiar in sheep. And I see a lot of it, unfortunately, especially with the longer staple growth and the super dense animals. Those are the ones that I see more cotting on. I do see it in cashmere. Cashmere doesn't felt as easily, but I do see cotting on cashmere goats, especially if you haven't harvested it quick enough, right? You guys who have them know that.
Find it on the fence.
Yeah, you find it on the fence, that's true. Hanging in strands. Okay, this is an important one financially, and I know there's going to be a talk about marketing fiber this afternoon. I think that hopefully is going to be a really good discussion. Yield of your fleece is expressed in all kinds of terms: grams, ounces, pounds, kilos. Whoever your buyer is, that's what they want to know. It's their term, not yours. For your own records, pick your term, and that's what you're going to be weighing in, whether it's grams and kilograms or ounces and pounds, for your own documentation. And I'm absolutely 100% for documenting every fleece that comes off your ranch or farm. Weigh it. You want to know your yield. You want to know how successful you are at producing fiber, if that's your goal. For the meat breeders, maybe that's not as important a characteristic, but wouldn't it be something if you found that you're producing some pretty high yield saleable fiber? And you didn't know that unless you kept records for it. So I'm a big record keeper fan to know that. The actual yield that you're talking about is clean, dehaired, dry, uniform fiber. Clean, dehaired means it's already been through one step of processing, hasn't it? That's your true yield. So if you send cashmere to a mill and they dehair it, they scour it and then they dehair it and haven't put it into yarn yet, that's the yield that you're going to get. And you're going to probably hear terms of your yield is 35%, 38%, 40%. Anybody have a cashmere yield they want to throw out?
The average is 50 if it's combed and 25 if it's shorn.
Okay? So per average yield, 50% if it's been combed off the goat, 25% if it's been shorn off the goat.
Deirdre, would that be what you're finding?
Well, after we wash fiber, we have varying weight losses in the wash, but if it's thoroughly combed, we get 64%.
Really? We'll talk later.
So it ends up being on average 50% of the raw weight.
So generally 50. In my experience with most artisan mills, the smaller mills, 20 to 45% is what you're getting. If you use the commercial dehairer, and they are out here, you can talk to them about that. They really require large batches of fiber to send through. They're gonna give you a yield number that's pretty darn low, but you also have the results of that process because that particular machine is huge and actually has multiple drop zones that you can actually get back. And they're coarser fibers or more varied in length, but they're still usable if you blend them with something else. So there is some regain with that. So their yields typically run 28 to 40% for prime, and then the drops are various percentages of that. So you might get back 50% from that process that's usable fiber. It's just you got some that's really good and some that's not so good. Generally, and I think you guys can confirm this for me, what I found is typically you're getting 3.5 to 6 ounces of down per goat.
Pleased with 6 ounces.
What's that? You'd be pleased with 6 ounces, okay. So we're right in that target zone anyway. And in mohair, we're getting a better harvest here. There's not as much to dehair out of them, so your yield should be in that 80% range. Any mohair breeders want to share their numbers around there?
Excuse me.
Yes.
Back on the cashmere, what are you getting? On which? Pardon? On which?
Cashmere dehair,
For shear.
yield,
For shear brush. No, production, total down weight, what are you getting?
down weight, so that will, either way, brushed.
If it's brushed, at most 200 grams. Just breeding specifically for high yield.
So 200 grams, somebody convert that. Anybody want to convert grams to ounces?
About 3 grams to an ounce.
That's a pretty nice yield. Congratulations. So something to shoot for, talk to her later. Maybe she'll give you some hints. Okay, and again, with the mohair, actual harvest on mohair, and again, I've seen some pretty low harvest numbers, and again, I think we're talking about young goats here versus an adult buck who might give me 25 pounds.
I do love to eat that one because
Do you want to know this micron?
No, I love.
Okay, so weight is directly related to length of fiber and fiber diameter, as well as follicle development and yield on the goat, right? So if you have a goat that's giving you 48 micron fiber that's 8 inches long, you're gonna get up there in that 20-pound range. Well, but would you want that though? Texas. Texas, okay? Not common, but somewhere in between is the range that you can get with that. And again, it depends on the age of the animal and whether it's a buck or not. I'm sorry?
That's annual?
Yes.
That's more like.
Okay. Yes. Okay, and again, in sheep wool, I've seen as low as 50% yield. I've seen, and I wrote 100%, I've seen some extremely clean, well-skirted sheep wool that when it goes in, you get back almost everything you get because you've taken care of your sheep before sending it to the mill. Most of those are the blanketed ones, to be honest. Okay, and again, you can get a 25-pound blanket depending upon breed and animal. Anybody have those? Should be later. I do buy fiber, by the way.
I think it's good to mention that if you have the fine wools that are very oily, the percentage of it goes down.
Ah, very good, yes, thank you, and I didn't mention that. So again, a high grease content, high oil sheep breed, that's part of the weight, and when you scour that, that's going to reduce your yield considerably. Okay, color is marketable characteristic. It's one of the more triggers for people when they buy fleece, and it might be the color of the day, okay, that they're interested in. White fiber typically has been the most desirable because it's white. You can do anything with it and you can dye it, and you can blend it with anything and make it a gray or lighter gray or a black into a gray, or mix it with a brown and get a nice soft brown. So white has always been the most desirable and usually has generated the most return for white. These are the color groups that I am familiar with. If there are others, please share. Cashmere whites, grays, and browns. Is there another version in there that I missed?
Some sort of fawn.
Fawn color, I wasn't sure if it's a true color or it's just a variation within.
It's a true color, but just not as common.
Where's it sorted? Where do they put that? Does it sort to its own color?
Well, we're all sort of on our own, so
Okay.
we decide whether we want.
So you decide whether you would put it in with something else. Okay. Mohair, white, tan, red, gray, and black. I'm a fan of the red. Just saying. Okay. And wool depends on breeds, all colors. Again, white is the most purchased color of sheep wool because they put it into everything and they dye it every color of the rainbow. Most of the wool buyers that I know that are independent wool buyers only want white. They don't want any color of anything, and they're very specific on micron.
So with mohair, you can dye virtually every color, but you're not going to get like pastels.
Right.
You're not going to get the real, delicate little.
Yeah, so over-dyeing color actually is an awesome thing
Yeah.
because you get some really nice tints and tones and shades. So it's actually a really great way to enhance what you produce.
An observation is that with the Shade to Save effort, it looks as though these heritage breeds who have these different colors, they're actually, it's becoming popular and the value of the colored wool is increasing.
Yes, and there are certain ones, and I'll throw it out to the alpaca world because I know there's a few alpaca breeders in the audience. Gray alpacas right now are hot, and gray fiber, so especially silver gray, is big. So it varies. So right now it's generating a pretty good return if you sell that fiber. And I would think it would hold true here too if you have gray because blending is an issue there, right? So
I have someone who's, really, she tells me that when she dyes her silver gray fleeces, that the colors just really
they
pop.
just really
So
pop.
she
Yep, it's a great overdye.
prefers to dye silver.
Yeah, especially blue on silver gray is stunning.
Can I
Good
just
market
ask
color.
a question about dyeing? My understanding was the white doesn't have much pigment, and so it's harder to get it to take a dye than something that's maybe lightly gray. Is that any truth to that, or is that just my brain?
I've never experienced that. I've not heard that. Now you got me something I gotta go research. I will say that guard hair, heavily medullated hollow core fibers do not take dye as well. So you're going to get some blotchiness in your dye if you have a lot of that present in your fleece.
Well, I have something to add.
Go ahead.
Fiber has dye points along it, where the dye will actually chemically bond, and so different types of fiber have more or less dye points. So for instance, merino wool and mohair have a lot of dye points, so you can get a lot of dye to actually stick on those fibers. Whereas fibers with a fewer dye points, I'm not quite sure where cashmere falls, but like alpaca is very low in the dye point spectrum. And so the natural color of that alpaca can kind of shine through. So if you were to take like a dark fawn alpaca and a white fawn and dye them both navy blue, the darker one is going to look like a navy blue that you would expect because that dark color kind of plays a part of the color formula, whereas the white fiber, it will be blue, but you're going to see kind of a bright luminescence behind that. This is the actual color of the fiber.
So for those of you
Between the dye molecules.
For those of you who don't know Deirdre, you designed greener shade dyes. She's hiding now because greener shades are awesome dyes. They're non-metal still, yes. It's actually my dye of choice, so thank you for being here and I could share a commercial for you.
Having experimented with greener shade dye on dark cashmere and light cashmere, it acts very much the same as alpaca does. So your dark cashmere will look a lot deeper than your white cashmere when it's dyed. But I was going to mention on your cashmere colors, something we have trouble here in the U.S. that New Zealand and Australia don't, is that we have goats with dark guard hair that produce white cashmere, and that is a lower grade than if you had light cashmere and white dark.
Yes, and that comes into color.
Yeah.
So that in a sense is contamination, I hate the word, but yes, it doesn't make it a true white anymore.
You know why?
Because you don't get every single guard hair out in the processing, and so that probably unless they're white. Fine. Is what they with them.
Mine used to be an average looking white on the side, but boys wouldn't know.
You can sort that and separate that out, and then you get a better yield of the color you're choosing. Yeah, was there a question over here?
I was just gonna add that Irrigate taught me years ago, if you blend fibers that have different levels of dye points and different characteristics, they take up the same dye differently, and your yarn gets a beautiful depth of color.
Yes.
Because you've got these subtle shifts.
And frankly, every cashmere lot is a blended lot
Yes.
of different animals, because no one animal.
You don't have enough fiber to do
a
one
fiber
lesson.
run, so you're actually that fawn color group that you have, and that dark brown color group that you have, and that so-called white color group, they're all every year different.
Right.
Depending on which animals you kept, which animals you culled, and where you happen to throw the lighter colors in.
Yes. And that's the key to sorting and grading, and know that you're going to get a batch that's closely similar, but it will have effects, especially with color, that you're going to have different shades of how they take those dyes. That's absolutely true.
So, a decade ago, we read somewhere that dark brown was something that for centuries was bred out of cashmere because it didn't dye well, and that for that reason we went for dark colors. And now I have quite a bit of the darker brown.
Yeah, and I think that was long enough ago that I think that's changed quite a bit. Since I've been in it, dark has been a popular color.
It is, it is.
And it does overdye.
I'm new to all this, so how do you find the dye point on the fiber?
I'll defray that one to Deirdre because she's my dye
I
entity.
didn't hear the question.
How do you find the dye point of a fiber?
I think you need that microscope.
Yeah. It's a trial and error thing.
Microscopic level.
Play with it.
Oh, okay.
Just try trial and error.
I think it's kind of like between the scale type thing.
Yeah, it's how it absorbs the dye and distributes it. It's never, if you're a chemical dye facility, that's of concern. As an individual dyeing or even an artisan mill use dyer, it's probably not as critical. You're gonna get what you get because it's the animals you're raising. And you'll start to see differences perhaps in your lots and your batches of fiber, as she said, on how that color holds in that fiber. And you'll know just from what you experience.
Okay,
Just a little bit of trial and error. So just a quick review before we get into the blending fibers, which to me is the fun part. Again, looking at cashmere, do we like that goat? Does he look good? Did I bring him home?
Where's his horns?
Yeah, he needs his horns.
Okay.
No horn, no.
No horns, he does not, no.
He's a hot goat.
So he can wear a blanket.
Okay, so again, down fiber, typically down 12.5. I don't see too much cashmere below that. I know it exists, but it's not the common. So up to 19, see, I put 19 on this slide. So that's the typical that you expect it to see to be cashmere. So what happens when it goes over 19 microns, you cashmere breeders? What is it? Cashmere. Yeah, I didn't use the word. And I didn't bring it because I have probably the stinkiest cashmere fleece ever that someone sold me as cashmere, and I got it in the mail and I was like, no. And so I use it for teaching, but I didn't bring it because the TSA dogs really hate my luggage. And that one's been open for a while. So, again, that guard hair diameter can be as fine as 20 microns, and I've seen it. And a lot of the 20 micron fiber just kind of stays put, and it's the stronger stuff that comes out. So the stronger that guard hair is, the easier it processes out. Staple length, 1 1/4 to 3 inches. Anybody have a 3-inch cashmere production? Awesome.
There's a lot of them now.
Good. I don't see a whole lot out west, but I think most of the cashmere production is
And
up
that
here.
again is that's the relax, like that's
Yes,
the relax.
yes, exactly. Average yield, I think we talked about. Your scale heights, okay? 0.4 of a micron for that scale height. It is really tight, close to the shaft of the fiber. So it takes a bit to get it to open up to felt. It doesn't have a whole lot of surface popped out to help that reflection of light, so it keeps that soft appearance to it. And the frequency, you get about 6 to 10 or 6 to 8 scales per 100 microns. Man, that's just such a tiny spot.
Do you aware of any business that will evaluate fiber for scale height reasonably cost, like available cost?
What's reasonable cost? Any lab is going to cost you money. There are labs that do that. Yoke McCall used to do this. I don't know if he still does, but he used to do scale height. So you can take, he's in Colorado, Littleton, Colorado. For those of you who do histograms, where do you use?
Most of it's either Texas A&M or
Texas A&M.
but there's what, Ladder or something.
You know, in Montana, I don't know if they still do it anymore. They used to do it as well. Texas A&M may do the height for you. There are some independent labs, but the price goes up drastically because it's out of the norm of what they're testing for with scale height. Mohair. Again, the fiber diameters, and this is just a recap of what we just went over. Your temp is generally over 50 micron. It's really strong stuff. It wants to fall off on the table when you shake the fiber. Tomorrow we'll see it. We can look at Mohair up close and personal and look at all of these things. Your staple length, generally 6 to 12 inches. Now, we talked about length earlier. Most small artisan mills don't want to process things in this length range, so you have to be absolutely certain that the mill you want to work with can do it, because they'll destroy your fiber otherwise. They won't give it a fair run. Deirdre, what's your length max?
Depends, carding, 10 inches is kind of
Carding,
our
10
max,
inches is
and
pushing it.
it's purely an equipment limitation.
It is, yep.
So if the fiber's too long, it just wraps around the drum and then it just brings everything to a screaming halt.
So be careful there. You can cut it, has its own issues, but you can cut fiber to make it more appropriate length. As a mohair breeder, do you shear twice?
Yes.
That helps. Okay. Your average yield, okay, we reduced our average yield here, haven't we, to something that makes more sense. Right?
And that's twice a year.
Yes, correct. But this is more what you're likely to see. The other is a range, but this is what you're more likely to see. Your high frequency, so your height again on your scale structure, 0.4, same as cashmere. It has that same attribute to it with scale height. Your frequency jumps up a little bit. It gives you a little more scales per micron in there.
Is that why mohair is shinier than
Yes.
cashmere?
Has more surface area to reflect the light. Exactly. And Kemp and your heterotype hairs are modulated, they are hollow. I'm going to back up just a minute if I can. Yay. All right, so this picture, this is an electron microscope picture. You can't see a hollow core in here. If you look very carefully on here, you can just barely see a medulla in this particular fiber. It's got a little bit of a shadow right there. A little hard to see. It might be easier to see on the TVs than here because they're a sharper image. This one doesn't have any of that hollowness in it. I don't have too many of those pictures to show today. So again, I can't show you the modulation here. I did not pull out a bunch of electron microscopic pictures. Had I known he had a microscope, I might have. We go into sheep wool. Again, your fine breeds generally go up to 22 micron, but they can go all the way up to 40. Breed dependent on that fiber diameter. Your staple length can be up to 8 inches. It actually can be longer. I've seen sheep wool really long. It's not the average. There's always exceptions to the rule. Again, your yield can be pretty high. I bought a fleece recently that was 19 pounds. Another Cormo, and it is stunning. I won't tell you what it paid for that one. A lot. So scale properties, again, the scale height is over double what it is in cashmere and mohair. So you have more surface that the light is getting to that's bouncing off. You have more dirt and debris getting trapped in those little pockets that exist in there. You have more opportunity for felting on and off the animal because those scales are out already before you add heat. Imagine that when you add heat and they really blossom out like a petal of a flower. They just want to grab each other. Not all sheep wool is going to be exactly that. There are some that actually have slightly less height and are harder to felt. That's what those are. That's why. It's the scale structure is probably interfering with that. And of course, just some different staple structures for this one. So let's talk about blending a little bit. So when we talk about blending, and I'm going to turn on the lights to wake up everybody in the front. Close your eye.
Is it morning?
Good morning. I was that boring that you fell asleep on me.
No, it's wonderful.
So when we talk about blending and possibilities for blending, which was actually where the focus of this was leading, knowing those characteristics of those fiber types and knowing the scale structure and knowing length issues kind of points to what is going to blend best with the fibers that you have or what you're producing in your livestock. So if you have a 13 micron, 1.5 inch long down fiber, you're not going to blend with it a Lincoln long wool. Okay? I mean, sensibly, it tells you you've got a length difference there, you've got a micron difference there, you've got a scale structure difference there. They're not going to play well together. And what will happen is the wool will become dominant and all of your beautiful cashmere down that you stuck in there is going to end up processing out. And you'll have a very little balanced mix there. And it may not happen right away, it may get enough twist to hold it in there, but when you spin yarn, and again, my mill friend will correct me if I'm wrong, the finer fibers have a tendency, because of the centrifugal rotation to spin yarn, the finer fibers migrate to the center and the stronger ones to the outside. So if you did that, all your cashmere's hiding inside and you're not going to feel it anyway. So it'd be a waste of money to do that as well. Okay? So when we look at possibilities for blending, we're going to look at the natural fibers. And the natural fibers that I've listed are not necessarily all the ones you could do. These are, again, the fibers that I consider on the exotic scale that have a higher dollar value perception to the public market. So when you blend with these types of fibers, people are thinking, ooh, there's Kiviot in there, it's worth more, right? Doesn't matter, there's only 5% Kiviot in it. It's got it on the label, it's worth more. And it's a marketing thing. Sometimes you will benefit from the attributes of those fibers. Okay, how to do that? It's not sure.
You can just skip it.
We're going to just roll it. It changed. There we go. It changed itself. We're not there yet. That's the last slide. So in looking at this, Angora rabbit, anybody raise rabbits? Nobody raised rabbits. I find Angora rabbit blends well with just about anything because you can get really good staple length. It's the one fiber I don't have.
I have some I can do.
Hey, awesome, she's got rabbit. Here we go, we got some rabbit. Wait, I found some rabbit in this.
I have 2 samples if you want that I brought you from Martin.
Okay.
And they're very, one has lots.
That'd be awesome if you don't mind, because I really do think it's a good blending fiber. And it blends well with just about any of what you're producing. So it blends well with cashmere if you keep the length within the proper length category. Generally, it's about 3 inches long. I wear black for a reason. I go home with fiber all over me. And this particular Angora has really strong hard hair. I don't know if you can see it. See how long that is? Okay. But if you dehair this and blend it with your other fibers, even mohair, because it's got some good length, you're going to gain a halo. Angora rabbit produces fuzz on the garments that it makes. And it's a really soft attribute because people are tactile and they touch it and they feel that. And it doesn't take a heck of a lot of this to enhance what you have without taking away from what you've had. So you blend this with a 3-inch long cashmere down, you're still going to benefit from that fine, soft hand of the cashmere, but you're going to enhance your halo from your cashmere. Adding just 5% Angora rabbit to it. Add this to your mohair, which is more of a silky, drapey type thing. You're going to get a little more loft, and again, that halo. And the luster's still going to come through from your mohair. But you're going to add something different. People are going to touch it and go, what is that? What's different here? It's still going to maintain the characteristics of your mohair when you do that. The same with wool. The wool is going to add a lot of loft because the crimped wool adds loft to your yarns. But again, you're going to add a little touch of softness that they're going to feel, a little more slickness to that touch. And again, the halo from this. Okay? Same as in reverse. She's got Angora rabbit that you raise. You just add a little bit of everybody else's and you gain that same attribute going in reverse. Okay? Doesn't take a lot to enhance fiber. Oh my gosh, she's got a lot of that. Oh, that's a dog. Hi, Pete. Do you mind if I pass it around?
Well, and there's, my rabbits aren't purebreds.
That's okay.
That's great.
That's great Pyrenees.
So there's a difference in the two fibers.
Not very much though.
But there's more hard in this one.
So I'm going to, it's separate sides of the room and you can just kind of put your hand in there and take a look at it. Put it back. Put it back. Please, put it back. As it's going around, you kind of get what I mean. When you feel it and you look at it, you see it has a lot of similarities.
I was wondering would it be true that the softer things feel, the less rubbing they can take, the less resilience they'll have for like an elbow?
Yes. So the question was, the softer things feel, doesn't that indicate it will have less resilience, it'll have less ability to wear well? It's going to, any hard wearing part of the body is going to wear that spot out quicker. That also is attributed to fineness. And just about any fine fiber will also do that, but yes, that is true. So when you look at these, yes?
Well, I was just going to, I had talked to somebody about spinning Angora into cashmere. They said, why would you want to do that? They're both too fine. You would have a really fragile item. Well, cashmere is a fragile item.
Right.
Designers who work with cashmere know that. It is fragile. It's because it's fine.
And there's nothing better than a 100% cashmere sweater. I
But
have
you would
two, I
not
know.
wear 100% cashmere stock because they wear out in no time at all.
Right. And so that would be a less appropriate use for cashmere would be to make socks, unless you added something to it to help add durability. Nylon, we'll get there.
What do they do when they make cashmere suits? I've seen suit material.
100%.
It's 100% cashmere, and they just expect it's a CEO who doesn't use his elbows.
So for you cashmere readers, and perhaps you don't know this, or maybe you do, cashmere needs to rest after wearing. It doesn't want to be worn every day. So does that guy wear his suit every day? He wears it once, he hangs it back up in the closet, and he wears it again next month, or whenever. Cashmere needs 24 to 48 hours rest before wearing it again. If you wear it every day, it's going to deteriorate
It's
faster.
also how the yarn is spun, so I would imagine
Absolutely,
that suit
yeah.
fabric is a worsted.
I'm sure it's worsted, yeah.
And,
I mean, it's low piano or somebody who's gonna make it, so.
right, so because it's the surface of the
And
fabric.
perhaps we can ask Nora later if she knows.
Can wear
She's in that area.
And it's something that's kind of, a woolen is fine, it's gonna be fuzzy and it might fill and.
Will dyeing help protect the fiber?
What was the question?
Will dyeing
Dyeing, no. Actually, you can weaken it because it's chemical. You're adding chemical. Even natural dyes add chemicals. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm a fan, obviously, of Angora rabbit. You can add it and it can do enhancement. I don't recommend adding a huge amount. Like I said, about 5% is probably enough to gain some benefit of that halo effect. And the halo effect alone, whether you benefit from the hand of the Angora or not, once you put your hand in those bags, doesn't matter because the halo is a visual and it's tactile when they touch it, but you're getting the finer fibers through it as well. Okay? When you put that with a wool, if you're putting it with a wool that is of a higher micron, you're still going to feel the higher micron fiber, but you're going to get the visual effect of that halo. And that's what mentally people look at and say, ooh, that must be soft because it's got that fuzziness to it, even though it may not be. So the next one on my list is bison. Bison. So I'm going to use this way. Oh, bison glove, don't send them around. Look at that.
Bison stickers.
So, yeah, those are great. So bison, and there's a booth out front, one of the vendors has a whole bucket of it. Raw bison and de-haired bison, usually that super de-hairer thing they have, okay? So I'm going to pass these around over here together so that you can see when they de-hair it, there's still hair in it. They don't take it all out. There's a tolerance level for the purchaser of this bison that says, this is good enough. I can make what I want to make out of this. And you'll see, you're all going to sit here and try to pull these guard hairs out of this. That's what I do. And when you do that, so if I were to take her gloves and I see guard hair and I try to pull it out, I'm weakening the structure of the yarn itself in the product. So less guard hair you have, less likely people are going to be poking at it to try to pull those out and weaken the structure. Bison is harvested from scraping hides. They're not too friendly for you to go up with your comb and bison. I judge yak, that's hard enough. The bison, no way. I've tried at the stock show and I won't even go in the pen because they just want to kill you. So when they kill the bison for beef, that's when they harvest off the hides and they scrape it or they shear it off the hides. So it's got a lot of stuff in it when you send it in to be processed.
Isn't that called cold then?
Yes. Yes. So there's a lot of guard hair because it's coming off with everything else. They're taking all of it and they have to de-hair it. So it's got a high loss factor. But if you feel it, it feels okay. It's not super soft. It does have a low micron count though. It is a short staple, generally under 2 inches. Especially that, if you look at it, feel free, you can open that up and look at it. So when you're blending, you're not going to put that with a 4-inch long fiber because in processing, that's going to end up poking out and migrating out of it. You're going to lose it. So why spend the money to do that if you're going to lose it? So you want to stick to, most mills that I talk to prefer half an inch difference tolerance. That's not much, right? Half an inch. The industry standard has been 1.5 inches for as long as I can remember. But when you're dealing with shorter fibers, it's not putting enough twist in that short fiber. So eventually they're going to migrate out and shed. And you're going to get that with the bison as well. But think about putting bison with something that feels similar. Because the hand of that is what's going to pass on to whatever you put it with. And I think it would blend quite well with some of the short staple wools. And I even think some of the meat breed sheep, and I just felt some fiber today that the professor in this room, somebody who knows him, want to share who he is, I don't remember his name, I'm sorry, but he runs this, shared my room.
Tony?
Yes.
He's not here.
No? But he came and got me out of the hall and handed me an envelope with 2 little sheep wool samples in it that he had taken from the barn out here. And had me talk to him about them, which was kind of neat actually, to be able to do that. But one of the samples was about 2 inches long, and it was beautiful. And they're crossbreeds out here, so they're nothing special. I wasn't even sure what was in this one, but it would blend perfectly with that bison. I immediately thought of that fiber when I held this fiber. So you can actually match those characteristics to help enhance what you have with the natural fiber.
What you're talking about with the meat breeds are kind of like a down breed that they were blending, I think would blend with the bison, or almost like a hair sheet.
It's a hair sheet.
Oh,
Or,
okay.
no,
That's still there on.
No, it's a
are
cross.
basically
It was-
Dorset and-
it was Dorset Fin something else. It had 3 in
Or
it.
Frisian,
And it was a
Frisian.
ram. Who's not here anymore, because I asked if I could go see him. He's not here anymore. So we know where he went. So it's interesting, some of the crosses, you can actually get some incredible fiber that's very usable and marketable, especially if you blend in. Okay, so now I have a wool bison cross or yarn. Just the fact that the word bison's on the label is going to make me pick it up and touch it, right? I do have bison. We talked about bison. I did pass them all around. Okay, so I did pass the yarn around as well. Just to feel the difference when you get it into yarn. But I would encourage you, because these are such small pieces, go out front. She's got bowls of it. You can get your hands in there. You can actually see it and really look at it. And she's more than happy to talk to you about the fiber and the process to go over to the dehairing from that. But it's a good way to see the raw fiber if you don't get a chance. So next one I have on here is yak. It's my personal favorite. I've fallen in love with these creatures, and if my husband would let me, I'd have 60 of them. They're a pretty amazing animal. So off the animal, dehaired, you comb it. It sheds naturally, just like a cashmere goat. You don't have to wait till they die to scrape their hides. Actually, they start shedding in February, March. You take a comb, the same comb you guys use for your goats, and you harvest it, and it is beautiful down with very, very strong guard hair. So it blends well with anything of similar characteristic. Now, why would I want to do that? Why would I blend a yak and cashmere? Cashmere's phenomenal on its own. Well, maybe you don't have enough cashmere. And you need to increase it to make enough of a yield to make some yarn. The yak are huge, right? They dehair the same way. You get about the same kind of yields, except the yields you get, because you get so much more off a yak than you do off a goat. Instead of getting 6 ounces, you get 2 pounds. So, relatively speaking, it can actually be a good mix. I would not necessarily suggest that it's the best mix, but it could be used. Let's put some yak, some silk, and some cashmere together. Doesn't that sound like a high-end yarn to me? I can imagine the fabric I would make out of that yarn. So it's catering to a different audience, a different marketplace, depends on where you sell your product, or who might want to buy it to blend it together.
You're talking about blending silk, and I was thinking that's a long fiber, isn't it? The same, because every time you say silk, I think Surrey alpaca, and that also is really long. So how do you do this? The lengths are the same.
So the mills, when they run a lot of these other fibers, such as silk and some of these man-made, they almost act as a binder to help guide the rest of the fiber through the equipment, and it naturally spins on its own.
So it's not, if you use silk or Surrey alpaca, you're not going to have it migrate to the center.
The fineness might, depends how well it's blended, and that's really up to the mill operator how well they blend and at what stage they're blending.
If you were doing it, would you want to put just a very minimal amount?
Yeah, I always, when I blend, I'm not into 50-50s. I want to blend a little bit of this, a little bit of this, to give me a little bit of those attributes of those fibers when I put it with, but I want my base fiber to shine. So if my base fiber is cashmere, that's dominant. So I'm going to put a little bit of the yak in there and a little bit of the silk in there to add some of the luster, because silk has luster and the cashmere doesn't. The yak's going to give it a little more loft and extend the hand and extend the volume of the cashmere that I have. And I'm going to have a blend that is going to give me a lot of attributes of cashmere with a little bit of that extra from those blending fibers. And the idea here is I have nothing against 100% wool, 100% mohair, 100% cashmere yarns. They have their place and they have their purpose in product. The idea of blending is to extend what you are already producing, give you a bigger yield to make product out of, and get more dollars for what you're producing. And some of these blends you can do inexpensively and increase the value of what you're doing considerably. So by adding silk to your cashmere, you can add value to that that's going to be higher than 100% cashmere yarn. Doesn't make sense, I know, but the marketplace looks at that and says, ooh, they're silky. That makes it more elegant and exotic, and I want that. You put yak in there, it makes it really exotic, there's not a lot out.
Would its resistance to wear increase by adding silk, which is, I always think of silk as being stronger.
Silk is stronger, that's why I said it acts like a binder,
So-
helps hold it together. So you're gonna get a little better wear, but you need to add enough of it to get that effect. And 3 to 5% is probably not enough to do that. So your percentages, and your mills should be able to help you with that percentage level and what those blends should be, to be able to give you the best. If that's what you're looking for, your mill should be able to talk to you and say, okay, you might need 15% silk to get that effect. Okay.
Is not silk a fiber that has no scale?
Correct,
Therefore, it has a different handle.
correct,
Therefore, it has a different draping capacity
absolutely.
than these other things are. And that would be one of the advantages of silk, is to put something into your fiber that, like a synthetic, adds draping qualities.
Yes. Good comments, thank you. Okay, actually, grab some more here. We'll do that bad last. So, I'll bring my notes on. So I guess I did it. Okay, so moving forward, again, that's yak, we're talking silk, we've been bouncing back and forth with silk here. I do have some silk here, and I have 2 silks. So I have, this is silk noil, and this is like remnants from processing silk. You can feel there's little lumps in it, and bumps and nebs and oils, just like we say. It adds texture to your yarn if you add silk noil. Okay? It'll add some luster to it, but silk noil is not typically a shiny thing, and if you dye it, it actually takes dye pretty well in comparison to what you're blending it with. But you can feel it, it's got texture to it, and that's what you're adding when you add that. These are 2 different kinds of silk, one's Bombex, one's Tussa silk, one's shinier than the other, and you can see the effect. And when you process that with others, it can be cut to shorter lengths if you need it to be cut when you're blending it. Again, the mill's the one that's blending it. If you're playing with this by hand at home, you're going to be doing it at the carding phase or a blending board. And it's going to separate out almost naturally where your other fibers are, because it's going to grab to those other fibers, and then it's going to just separate out from your top that you've got with those silks. So it does add luster, especially if you're using the Bombex silk. There are a lot of people who have preferences for one over another, a lot of varieties of silk. It takes dye really well. It is a protein-based fiber, so when it does dye, it takes dye that you would use on your protein-based livestock, right? So you don't need to change your dye source to be able to get a good dye stripe on your fiber. Colors sell. If you're looking to market, colors sell when you're blending. Okay, any questions on silk? I think we've kind of beat it up. Kiviot. What's Kiviot? Muskox. Do we have them here? Alaska. The only place, right? Canada and Alaska. We're not allowed to have them here. You can't own a muskox. It's lost. They are Inuit, Indian, natural, endangered species. So they are in Alaska and Canada. Again, the booth out front, I asked her to bring 2 things. I asked her to bring bison, and I asked her to bring Kiviot at the NFP booth, because I wanted you to see how similar Kiviot and Cashmere are. If you haven't had the opportunity, and she's got a nice big bowl, but boy, it's really tempting to. When I brought these, when I said, can I have some for the class, I'll bring them back. She said, oh no, you can have it, so pick up your bowl. No, didn't go with that at all. So Kiviot is a muskox, and there's a great picture of one on one of the Wild Fibers magazines out there. I think it's a current edition. Again, not an animal you're easily going to be combing it out of. They do shed naturally. Similar species, eh? Just like cashmere, they comb out naturally. The Indians harvest it by picking it up off the ground in wild environment. Now, the station where this came from is actually a educational station. They are raising muskox to learn about them. So they do put them in chutes to brush them. These are more,
brush themselves?
yeah, well, they do have brushes too that they harvest on, but they actually put them in a chute that's got a door on the side, and then lift the door open and brush them because you don't want to be anywhere near them. They're not friendly. They just are not social animals.
I just met a young woman who's just down visiting from Alaska, and she's very much into the native arts, and she says to shoot them, because winter is hunting time, and every time there's a muskox shot, they skin it, and they actually scrape all the fiber
Right.
off. That's where the commercial career comes from.
Right, for the commercial they do, and it's harvested the way bison is. That's how bison that we passed around earlier, that's shaved hides or scraped hides. Now, in Alaska and Canada, they do it with a special knife because it's part of the natural process of how they did it in historic days, and they keep that history going with that. So when you look at Kiviat, which runs, by the way, $120 an ounce or more, just to give you an idea what you're passing around the table. Why she wouldn't give me the gold. And it's hard to get. And I did ask her if it was something you were interested in blending with, can you get it? Because it's very difficult to buy. It's in Alaska and Canada. It's not something we see around the corner here. And we're working on that. So if it's something you're interested in and blending and doing something very exotic, unique, okay, I just told you how much per ounce it is. Imagine blending that with your cashmere or some fine wools as a marketable product to be able to label it that it's got Kiviat on it. You've just increased its skein value from $30 to probably $90 or $100 because that's in there. So maybe something you want to research if you're interested. Leave your name with her down there or me later.
Who is paying $90 a skein?
It happens to linebacker.
It does happen.
Yeah.
Most and Maryland Sheep and Wool and out west at the Denver Stock Show.
So very small volume.
Right.
But it is
But
getting.
if it's on your farm,
Yeah.
okay, and I don't know what you guys consider small farm, let's say you have less than 50 animals that you're harvesting and you're getting 4 ounces from each animal, right? So calculate that out for me, somebody. So 4 times 5 is 200 ounces divided by 16, 10 pounds of fiber, right? How much yarn are you going to get out of 10 pounds of fiber? You can enhance it with a little bit of this. Some of it, you don't need to do all of it.
Yeah, but at 90, it's not just that, it's also.
Well, it's where
The
your
folks
market
at
is.
Maryland and Rhinebeck have put a lot of time and money and effort into advertising.
Well, there are also online sites that sell fiber quite well.
I think it's a good point though, because, so few people know what this stuff is.
Right.
That it's.
And sometimes it's
also
just-
an educational.
It's an education, and just having one skein of it handy